So the project was called GEGPRI, Gender Education and Poverty Reduction Initiatives, and it was a study in Kenya and South Africa and in selected global organizations about how the three MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals on poverty, gender and education, were understood at all these levels. So how people understood the policy, how they translated or negotiated meanings of the policy, and what made implementing the policy easy and what might make it difficult. And the project design worked with a kind of quasi-action research design. So we were looked at interpretations of the MDGs and actually the Education for All agenda as well, the EFA agenda, at the national ministries in Kenya and South Africa of education, at a provincial level, provincial departments, and at a school in a poor neighborhood. And then we also looked at the non-government sector, at a very rural NGO, and then at an NGO that was located in a very large city and was interfacing with Europe and North America. And we also did some interviews and observations in so-called global organizations, multilaterals, global NGOs, the kind of London, Paris, New York kind of settings. So that was the design, that was the intention. And I think it started out as a project around policy transfer. How was there a kind of missing the message process, a kind of going on? But in fact, what we found was a lot more interesting, I think. And I think what we found was that the meanings of gender were very locally, and poverty were very locally understood, very contested, and very historically contingent. And that the way that gender connected with poverty or connected with education also couldn't just be read off an international menu. And while that notion of local contestation around global policy is not a new one, I think that the sad part of what we found was that part of the contestations over meanings of gender were often not in the direction of equality, in contexts in which those definitions of equality didn't make sense. So often where teachers were themselves under pressure to deliver good grades in the school leaving exams, poor children came to school, didn't do well. Instead of blaming a new public management system or systems of audit or their lack of training, they blamed poor parents for not feeding their children. So we have this process that we've called blaming the poor, and that when people didn't understand gender or found it was disruptive or uncomfortable, it was often blame around girls' sexuality or girls' pregnancy. And this in South Africa was in the wake of the HIV epidemic. The big introduction of antiretrovirals was only coming at the end of our study. So I think there was an assumption built into the MDG policy frame that the world would go forward. Millennium Development Goals, the problem was poor planning and the lack of targets. But I think what we found was that aspects of local meanings and lack of support for people about how to interpret that and contextualize them in relation to their own experiences and debates and concerns, then a rather sour version of this crept in, and I think that's like a warning for us around the SDGs. Another key finding, cut me off if it's too long, is that the policy arc is interpreted in a very mechanistic way. A policy will be passed in New York or by some big participatory process of governments, and then it'll be implemented in a school. But between that are a huge range of relationships. We call them we're now starting to call them the relationships of the middle, that haven't been well documented. The social relationships of the middle haven't been well documented. It's to some extent a vertical axis has been connected. It's either top down or it's bottom up. But actually there are many, many layers of the middle, and academics, researchers, policy brokers, negotiators, teacher educators, the media are all these groups of the middle which are not well studied and not well theorized. And I think that was the other thing we found. So in terms of impact, if you think, there has been a tendency sometimes to think about impact. You'll change policy at the top, or maybe you'll change it at the bottom. But it's all these connections between the top and the bottom through the middle that I think impacts is located, and there are social relations of impact which we need to understand. An example that I'm pleased about, even though I don't know which way it's going, is that at the international level, in terms of the MDGs conceptualize gender and education in terms of gender parity. So the notion was, if there are equal numbers of girls and boys in school or progressing through school, that's good enough. And one of the things I've known from work I did even before this project is that you can have gender parity, but all the structures of inequality, of gender inequality, and the intersecting inequalities that support that around ethnicity or race or class persist even though girls are going to school. So while some quite big actors, I think, continue to use the gender parity language and say, okay, the issue is get girls into school, and let's have big projects about get girls into school, and the issue is girls are out of school, and you get a very powerful figure with the moving experiences like Malala, who becomes a spokesperson and a really key symbol of that. However, there's so much else going on, and I think one of the things is, and it's not only our research that put this on the agenda, but it was part of a whole sea change, I think, amongst researchers, to say actually what we need to measure is not just gender parity, and what we need to have in the SDGs agenda is a bigger commitment to gender equality. And it sounds so nerdy to be delighted about a phrase, but it was a phrase that got inserted into the SDGs through the kind of mobilization of a really active group of advocates around gender. So there's a gender equality part in the SDGs, and then we've been very active in campaigning with UNICEF, UNGAI, UNESCO, and UNIFEM around changing the measure in the SDGs. So it's not just gender parity, and there's been a lot of pushback from the statistical community because gender parity is a very rigorous and good measure. But I think we're starting to get other measures into the language and the vocabulary, and so that's something that I think has happened at that top level. At the bottom level, I think I'm now not so astonished when I go into a workshop or a project on teacher education, or even a session that I was just in here at this conference, where people contest the meanings of gender, because I think I'm now understanding some more of those local contexts and thinking that you must have research projects that really try to engage that.